to the north of Kharkiv, which is obviously very important because Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city. The Ukrainians have actually been pushing the Russians back slowly, but back towards the border. And I wanted to look at some of the reasons that this brigade was having successes. And it does seem to me, in the time that I spent with Ukrainian troops, that the best motivated, best equipped, and best organized brigades or special forces are the ones that have adopted NATO command and control structures and planning methods. And Kharkiv is the same. So they had been, as a National Guard brigade, they had been trained by Ukrainian officers, had been trained by NATO in 2018, then formed it according to NATO standards, make NATO decision-making processes, and it's a much more democratic way of warfare. So you have a brigade commander that will listen to some of the junior officers in a command center. They will war game and analyze different methods and the outcomes of those very meticulously and put a lot of effort into doing that before they issue orders. And that seems to save lives, and it also seems to motivate the troops. Now, for that reason, they have attracted quite a lot of international fighters as well. And I was spending time with a young Scottish lad, 19 years old, who left the British infantry to come and fight for Ukraine. And he had chosen the Kharkiv Brigade, along with many other international comrades, because they have a different way of fighting it. It's a more democratic approach, and they're more confident that their lives won't be wasted and thrown away by a commander that makes a decision without having all the information, without listening to his subordinate officers.
That's really interesting. Just on the command structure, is there a reason that the Ukrainian forces more generally haven't been able to replicate that? Why is it limited only to certain brigades? Is it because it is actually harder? It's easier said than done to implement that kind of command structure across the board.
So since 2014, I think the West really focused on training the National Guard units in this kind of new NATO structure. And the Ukrainian army is still based on this kind of inherited Soviet doctrine and has been changing. But obviously, it's difficult to change the command structure and train hundreds of thousands of troops in a different way of thinking during this time. And especially when you're at war, to radically change these things is difficult. Kharkiv have been training other brigades in this. They've been training the command staff of other brigades, 59 other brigades that they've trained. And Syrskyi seems to be quite happy with that and wants more brigades to adopt this NATO structure. But while they're in the transition phase, they told me that they have to produce 2 order documents every time for the senior commanders, because they have to have the NATO-style documents for internal use, and then they have to have the Soviet-style orders for external use, within the armed forces. And that's taking a lot of time and complicates matters. I think it's always difficult to reform something, and especially you don't want to be changing the way that you give orders while a battalion is in active combat with the Russians. So I think that's the difficulty. They are trying to do it, but it requires some time, and it requires brigades who have been rotated somewhere perhaps calmer or for some rest.
Just to go back to, you mentioned that young Scottish lad that you were speaking to who signed up for the brigade. What was motivating him? Because, at the start of the full-scale invasion, we heard a lot about non-Ukrainian volunteers, fighters going out there to serve alongside the Ukrainians. Maybe you don't see it so much now, but obviously in his case, he's very much been motivated to do that. What did he tell you about his motivations, almost 3 years into this conflict now, since the full-scale invasion, to go out and fight alongside the Ukrainians?
Well, he talked about some of the worst excesses that we've seen during the invasion, rape, torture, executions of prisoners, and the feeling of injustice that he felt when he saw what was happening in Ukraine. And he was motivated as someone who had military training in the British infantry and the reserves, to go and do something about it. And so for him, it was very important that, something that the West understands the situation with Russia. He thinks that Russia is a war machine that will not stop in Ukraine and will carry on to other countries. He doesn't want to see other European countries threatened in that way. So he kind of took his understanding and his training and did something directly about it. You do see there are increasing numbers on both sides, actually, of foreign mercenaries, basically people who are well-trained soldiers that have come for a paycheck. And in that brigade, there's actually a number of Colombian fighters who were in the Colombian armed forces during the fighting with FARC and then were demobilized after that. And they've come and applied their skills in Ukraine. But Ukraine has been very, very welcoming to those troops. They don't use them in the same way as the Russians. So the Russians will use such, foreign troops basically as cannon fodder. But Ukrainians are quite careful with them. They appreciate that they've got previous skills and experience, and they try to make the most of that. And they rely on a lot of them for sergeants in the Kharkiv brigade. So I think that's also some of the attraction, that if you've got the training, the military experience, that Ukraine will try and put you to good use.
And just finally, Maxim, obviously we're entering December now. We're properly into winter. How much movement do you expect to see on the front lines in Ukraine over the course of the next few months?
Well, typically, when the ground is very hard and frozen, and it's miserable fighting conditions, and then it rains, and then it freezes, and it rains and freezes, it's typically not conditions that troops want to fight in, and they tend to try and stay indoors and away from advancing across large territories, particularly when it's difficult to advance with vehicles because of FPV drone threat, which is just exponentially increased. Now, if you go near the front in a vehicle, you can expect to be targeted by FPVs either side. So I think it normally would mean slow going, but then we also have this idea that come January, peace talks might be forced upon both sides, which would mean that they have now to jockey for the best possible position. And that's why we see some reports of a Russian troop build-up in Zaporizhia, I suppose, so that the Russians can try and get the best possible foothold in a region that they claim as their own before they go to peace talks, which I think also demonstrates how difficult it will be for the Trump administration to get a reasonable settlement. If the Russians are already saying they're pushing to try and get every square inch of territory from the four Ukrainian regions that they claim now as Russian, it's going to be very difficult to see how you can reconcile those ambitions with Ukraine saying, well, look, there's four regions that have been our territory forever, and you came and just took part of them. Are we going to accept that in any form? Especially while you're still trying to take some of the major cities in those regions. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to find a meaningful ceasefire agreement, let alone a just and lasting peace, which I just think is nearly impossible to find at this point.
Obviously, we've had in recent weeks the approval of the ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles, long-range missiles supplied by the US and Britain, respectively, for use inside Russia, inside Kursk Oblast. Are we seeing much sign already, Maxim, of that having an impact? Or is it going to be like so many of these weapons? None of them in and of themselves are a game changer, but it's part of an overall suite of materiel.
It's certainly a big morale boost. So I've been in the Kharkiv front, and I've been in the Donbass front this trip, and it was certainly brought a big morale boost to the troops, especially some of those troops in Kharkiv who said that they'd seen Su-27 jets flying overhead with Storm Shadow missiles and letting them off and firing them on that day when the Ukrainians attacked a command center which had North Koreans and a Russian general in it, and causing a lot of casualties. So that has been a big morale boost for them, and it does provide serious new capabilities for Ukraine to strike at Russian air bases, to strike at infrastructure, and different kind of strategic targets that are further away from the front line. So if those weapons can be provided in quantity, that would make a difference to the war. And we hear that that Storm Shadows have in fact been supplied in some quantity prior to this decision being made, and Ukraine is obviously just deciding to use them very carefully and maybe keeping some back because they don't know what the situation will look like post-Trump. I think it would be sensible for Ukrainian generals at the moment to be rationing their use of such weapons because they don't know how many they will have and what the situation will be going forward. But like anything, this war has proved that Russia is much more capable of building a military industrial complex very rapidly than the West. And the West, despite all of its economic prowess and all of its technological advancement, has responded very, very slowly to something that is really a credible threat, not only to the rules that the West lives by, but also to the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of other countries that Putin might be interested in and has set up historically part of Russia's sphere of interest. And it's kind of astonishing that we're 3 years in now and there's still a struggle to manufacture more things such as Storm Shadow in order to help defeat this existential threat.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.